Okay, thanks very much, Adriana. Do you believe in Chinese fortune cookies?
Yes.
Well, you will be soon in the company of interesting and captivating people. So, well, here I am. So, I got this in Chinatown in San Francisco last week, and my wife said, whoa, this is a good omen. So, let's see. Let's get right to it. And the first time I was in Sri Lanka, years ago, a friend, an old colleague, met me at the airport, and he said, can we take a few minutes to go to a temple? And of course, a temple, yes. And he said, this is to Patina goddess. And I said, never heard of this goddess. And he was shocked that I hadn't heard of Patina Devi. And then it came up in the course of driving to this side that his wife had just been diagnosed with cancer. They had 2 lovely kids. And at the shrine, I could see that it was a very serious business for him because of his wife's recent diagnosis. And we were there certainly for that problem that he had. And then I said to him coming back, I said, well, trying to sympathize, well, you know, that's the luck of the draw. Trying to sympathize with him, that how life is so capricious. And then he turned to me and said something I'll never forget. He said, well, I guess. And you could tell that there was something beyond the capriciousness of life that we all accept that determined his wife's cancer, being received with cancer, and being cured, that there was something different. It was not just the luck of the draw, as I suggested. And that's exactly why we went to this temple where he made a very large offering, a cash donation to the priest. But it's in that context that I want to put my remarks. And with that story in mind, you can see the connection between these 2 goddesses that I'm speaking of and what we would have to call the human condition. Now, we've all been in a rage and we've all been in despair, but we've all been in love and we've all had hope. 2 sides of a coin, aren't they? And rage doesn't mean much without love, and despair doesn't mean much without hope. But these deities, these 2 female, we'll explore their histories in a moment, these 2 deities will emphasize how this wheel of life, how the human condition, and how these 2 deities, the worship of these 2 deities, fits into that. Okay, the next. Now, one became a goddess, and this is Patina. This is the goddess that we visited, whose temple we visited outside of Colombo in Sri Lanka on the left. And one became a nun. One is a Hindu deity on the left, and one is a Buddhist. Hate to call her a deity, but she has become somewhat deified. Her story is part of the Buddhist canon, and we'll see how it relates to her history soon. And the next, and you'll see where these deities are most popular. Patina is in southern India and in Sri Lanka, but especially popular in Sri Lanka. She began her history in Tamil Nadu, in southeastern India, and then quickly migrated to Sri Lanka, where she became extremely important as she is today. Patichara, this is the nun, is largely important in Southeast Asia, which of course is largely Buddhist in nature. So Patichara, as a nun, a Buddhist nun, but Patichara is also popular in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is largely a Buddhist country. So in some ways, she kind of goes in both directions, into Southeast Asia, which is Buddhist, and to Sri Lanka, which is largely Buddhist. But Patini herself, the deity, emerges from a strictly Hindu context, as we'll see. The next. And as a measure of their popularity, they have been in films and comic strips and everything else, as you might imagine. And this is Patini on the right, and you'll see this thing she's holding. That's the anklet, which is the subject of, which is the center of her story. And this is Patichara. This is actually from a Nepalese film, but to also give you the sense of how widespread both of these stories are. And the next. And so here's Patini on the beach at Chennai, former Madras. You see her pointing this way, but most significantly is this anklet in the hand. One of my students said, "Oh, this must be a kind of Statue of Liberty holding a bagel." Anyway, but just shows you that things that we've never heard of before, and I had not heard of Patini 20, 30 years ago, but is of major importance to large parts of the Indian subcontinent and certainly Sri Lanka. And it was this deity, it was this temple to this deity that my friend and I visited years ago. And the next, please. Now, how are these stories transmitted? It's through manuscripts. It's through palm leaf manuscripts. I know this doesn't look like a palm leaf, but they're cut and treated, and they're usually about this long. Sometimes this long, sometimes this, but usually about this space. And covered, you can see them stacked one upon the other in the image on the bottom, and concealed and protected by boards, both on the bottom and on the top. And here in New York, you can see everything like this. You can see it at the Met and probably here on display sometimes at the Asia Society. The leaves many times are illustrated, many times they're not, just with text. But it's through these palm leaf manuscripts that these stories have been told and retold for nearly 2,000 years. These are from the 18th, 19th century. Very few have survived from the first millennium. But it's these palm leaf manuscripts that have carried on this tradition, along with the oral traditions from father to son, mother to daughter, etc., that we have these myths, these entire stories. And the next. And today in Sri Lanka, you'll see this is really a Sunday school, basically. They have them on Saturday and Sunday when kids are not in school. This is at a temple outside of Colombo with a monk instructing these young girls and young boys on the other side in Buddhist principles. And it's in this context that they will tell the story of Patichara. They all know the story from childhood, but it's reinforced by monks in this instructional capacity. The next. Now back to Patichara and Patina. Good and evil, and these are concepts that we deal with daily, like rage and despair. And how we'll see how these two goddesses really formulated two different reactions to both good and evil. But they're underscored, the next, by making sense of the senseless. Now, that may sound very matter of fact, but it's something we're constantly confronted with. How do we make sense of evil? How do we make sense of things that happen to us? How do we make sense of my friend's wife's cancer? Is it me? Is it something I've done? Is it something other people have done to me? And if so, whatever the answer, how do I repair myself? And so at every level, the concept of good and evil and how we interpret that is one of the answers that Buddhism and Hinduism have in some ways answered in the same way. And we'll come to that in a minute. So the next, and just to remind us, how do we all cope with such tragedy? Why this school? Why not another? Why that child? Why not another? And so it's those elements, making sense of the senseless, that we all have our answers. All of us are very personalized answers, which change from situation to situation. But it's all based on that. And the next, or the bomb blast in Sri Lanka at Easter. Making sense of the senseless. The next, or evil on a mass scale. How do we make sense of that? The next. Well, in some ways, it comes down to our old friend karma. And I don't mean to trivialize this, but the sense that every action has a consequence. It can be a good action with a good consequence, or a bad action with a very bad consequence. And these follow us through. And we have this concept of karma. And this one, of course, the dominoes, what comes around, goes around. And in some ways, in our own language, even though we don't, all of us believe in karma, we in some way implicitly do when we say, what goes around comes around. Or he's going to get what he deserves. Think of all of our expressions in English. Or he's going to go to you know where. Or she's so nice, she's going to go to heaven, which is another form of good consequences from good actions. But it's that interplay of our own lives and our actions and consequences for the present and for the future. And so we'll see with the next. For us, much of it starts right here with Adam and Eve. This is where our problem started, where they took the apple. And this was an act of disobedience. And so the consequences for that, well, here we are. I mean, this is a simplistic view of the Christian interpretation of this mythical event. But in some ways, you can see karma in this context is working in a very direct way. And the next. And of course, vivid images of hell in Western art and in Asian art. And these are all obviously consequences. And today we don't have these visions in our mind. Although I was reading, Mr. Google told me that 78% of Americans believe in heaven, but only 58% believe in hell. I don't know what that tells us. But we don't have that sense, oh my gosh, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to hell if I do this. We rarely, most of us, don't think that way. But I'm sure all of us, when you're just about ready to do something naughty, we're probably going to our mind, uh-oh, if I do this, well, something bad's going to happen to me. And that is a sense of karma. It's illogical because there's no way to prove it, these consequences from good or bad actions. But we have that thinking anyway. And certainly when we look around us, we say, oh, he's got to go down there to hell. He's so bad and evil. And this is no less true in Asia, the next, where we see vivid images of hell. And if you look closely on the bottom right, you see the man with the opened mouth and the big, I think this one, he's going to be permanently for a root canal or something. You see right there. But they're vivid, hundreds, thousands of vivid images like this. And the next in Asian art. And this is from modern Burma, which I call the hanky-panky hell. And some folks here engaging, having a lot of fun. But, uh-oh, look on the right. They're in trouble. And so you'll see this direct connection in people's minds between these kinds of activities, good and bad, and their consequences. And the next, or from Sri Lanka, these poor folks getting gobbled up by angry turtles. Not so much fun. And so, but it's this kind of imagery, both in literature, in songs, in ballads, and in art, contemporary art and older art, that really, really help determine one's views of these things. And the next. Now, the Buddha had previous lives in which he also had good and bad karma, even the Buddha. The good karma is pretty well known. And the next one, through the series of stories, they're known as Jataka stories. There are hundreds of them. This is one of the best known ones. This is the rabbit. He's offering himself to a starving man. He's jumping on the fire to cook himself, barbecue himself for someone who is starving. Self-sacrifice. It's sacrificing oneself, in this case the Buddha, in a previous birth as a rabbit, self-sacrificing himself for the benefit of others. And for this, the starving man turns out to be a deity. We see here, oh, this was a test. And he passed with flying colors. And guess what? You see the man painting the image of the rabbit to memorialize this act of goodness in the moon. And so I think the next slide, please. I think it shows it a little, shows it much better. The rabbit ready to jump. And the deity now putting his picture on the moon. These are just one of many stories that the Buddha's his perfections over previous lives that went on for beyond time. This was not in his own lifetime, obviously, but stretching back eons and eons. And the next. And when the Buddha confronted with the evil demon Mara, whom we see on the elephant here, guess who saves him? The earth goddess, who pierces up from the earth. You see her with that, pierces up with the little vessel in her hand. And she has witnessed all of these perfections, all of these previous births. And for that good karma, the demon is now defeated. And so it has, in this case, very, very definite consequences. One could even argue without the earth goddess and certainly without these previous good, righteous births, there would be no enlightenment. There'd be no Buddhism. So you can see how closely these are united. And the next. Now, Buddhists through the ages had problems. And the problems were, in the literature, the Buddhist canon, we read of the Buddha having difficulties. His death, for example. His death. How did that happen? Or in this case, the Buddha had migraines. Why, if the Buddha is perfect, should the Buddha have anything happen to him? Well, there's an easy answer for that. And these are previous births in which the Buddha did something naughty. And in this case, the previous Buddha's father was a fisherman. And so when the Buddha saw his father killing the fish with a big club, he rejoiced. Oh, this is food for the family and everything else. And it was just for that thinking about this bad act that his father was participating in, just thinking about it, that caused the Buddha himself to have migraines. There's a wonderful story about a Buddha image in Burma that was taken. How does this story go? It was returned from, the British had taken it during Victoria's time. Victoria was struck with headaches. And so everybody advised her, take this Buddha, give this Buddha back to Burma. And of course, when the Buddha went back to Burma, she no longer had the headaches. This is a very popular story in Burma today. But it's that same sense of karma and coming around, doing the right thing at the right time. And the next, this is another one where the Buddha's death, here on the right. And how did this happen? The Buddha was a boxer, but he broke the rules and stepped on broke somebody's back, something he shouldn't have done. And so this karma eventually caught up with him and resulted in the Buddha's death. And the next. Now, karma it does start in the womb. It's transgenerational in ways that we cannot anticipate. And this is one of the things that I think that is so hard for many Westerners to understand. In our sense of what karma is, what heaven and hell is, you've got one chance. You've been bad, to hell. And that's it, or to heaven. But in a Buddhist context, these are, I guess you could call them transgenerational, that can go on for eons of time. Eons of time. And so the bad karma that can come to you can be something not that you did when you were 10 years old, nor even your parents, but from people that you never knew. And there are countless examples of this, of people who suffer, who explain suffering by, there's one story in Sri Lanka, a monk who was put in a boiling cauldron. And he was such a saintly monk. Why did this happen? Well, in a previous life that he couldn't recognize, he hit a fly, killed a fly that was in some milk boiling. So in this system, in our way of thinking, if something bad happened to us, we can attribute it. Oh, when I was 14, I did something horrible or something. But in a strictly Buddhist context, it can be something about which you have no concept of. I remember vividly a story. A friend of mine was getting a bitter divorce from his wife, and this Burmese woman chimed in, maybe you were a guard at Auschwitz because you're trying to take something. And so it was that kind of, but it's that kind of thinking that is certainly evident in Buddhist literature. It's less obvious when you're speaking to people, but those deeply immersed in this system of thinking, this is not a foreign concept. And the next, and that's why that one with the womb, the picture with the child in the womb, that karma begins. I guess this could go to the Supreme Court, couldn't it? Anyway, but the story of Patina Devi is an old one. It's at least as old as the 6th century after Christ, and it's in a classic text in the language known as Tamil, which is in southern India, and it's known as the anklet. And the heroine here is known as Kannagi. That's her personal name. But the name that we give the deity is Patina Devi. And the next. Now her story, I tried in vain to look for beautiful illustrated manuscripts. There ain't none that I could see. But I had to come to this famous comic book series that you find everywhere in India. And so I quickly ordered it on Amazon, and last week I took these pictures for you. And it says, her love conquers all. Well, that's really a soupy 20th century thing. It's really her rage conquers all. And we'll see when you see her story how this plays out. The next. So everything starts out fine. She's wedded to the perfect gentleman. Everything's cool. Until the next. He meets the dancer. And so he's infatuated with the dancer and abandons poor Kannagi. And that's the source of her rage. The next. That's the source of one of her rages. We'll see more. But of course he repents, relents, and returns to Kannagi. It won't happen again, he says. And the next. And then he needs, by this time, I failed to mention, that he'd spent all of the family's wealth on his mistress, this new woman. And so they're broke. And so he said, I need capital to start my business again. And so she says, as the good, devoted wife, take my anklet and sell it. And you can take this as your startup money for your new business. And fine. So they go off to the big city, Madurai in South India, And the next, and goes to the goldsmith we see here on the right. Says, oh yeah, this is great. And then he, this conniving guy, says, it's exactly like the queen's anklet. And my wife would like this anklet. I'm going to take, and he had been fixing the queen's anklet. And so, of course, what happens next, he takes this anklet and substitutes it. And so he gives his wife the king's or the queen's anklet. And we'll see in the next, please. And this is the no good Nick, I call him. And he's the goldsmith with the bracelet, with the anklet. And the next. And so, and at this point, he, of course, the goldsmith, being just so horrible, tells the king, oh, your wife's anklet, the queen's anklet, has been stolen. I know who did it. This guy, Kanagi's husband. And so the king jumps to conclusions and slays the poor husband. Yeah. And so then you can see the beginning of her rage. And the next. And so Kanagi comes to Madurai, and she's got her own bracelet. And her own bracelet has diamonds in it, her second bracelet. And she said, that's not the bracelet, and opens it. You see the diamonds falling here. And of course, now the king, and the real bracelet contained gold. Gold, was it? Yeah. Anyway, it's in the story. Gold opens up his bracelet, and the next, and the king realizes his horrible action and just dies on the spot. But it's one, you can see how karma is working itself out here. And so in the next, and so Madhavi, this is Kanagi, who severs one of her breasts and flings it at the city of Madurai, which is engulfed in flames. And so she's taken her revenge. She's furious, and this is why love conquers all. No. It's rage. Rage conquers all. And the next. Now, in a previous birth, and there she is, in the previous birth, read this one carefully. It is your husband's sin in a previous birth that has brought about this tragedy. And because in a previous, as the text tells us, in a previous birth, eons and eons ago, the husband had committed the false sin of killing someone unjustly. And so what comes around goes around. And so we see that in the next. But all things, and this is Kovalam, is the husband. There's Kanagi in the center. And Madhavi is the attractive mistress. And the next. And this anklet is become a symbol of revolt and rebellion and protest. And so this is from a demonstration in Madras, in Chennai today. And women will carry this anklet as a symbol of the unjustness of the world. And the next. This is the temple that outside of Colombo that my friend and I visited that day when he told me about his wife's cancer. And the next, we'll see, this is all for Patina. And the next, and these are the fruit offerings that people make. you can offer cash to the temple, or mostly people offer these huge plates of fruit. They're sometimes so large you have to have a servant, a coolie, professional carrier, carry them for you. And the next, stepping up to the temple, and the next, and the next. And this is the temple that we visited, and it's always packed with people going in and out. And the next, and there's Patina Devi. This was herself, and she's usually showing holding both, I think for symmetry, if nothing else. And interestingly, she's not, even though she's in some ways a wrathful deity, because she has destroyed a city and she's got so much to be angry about, she's never shown in a ferocious, terrific way, the way the goddess Durga or Kali is shown so often. And the next, and this is when we were there, this is a special offering, and you give us extra bit of cash in order to make an offering like this, and you get a drum and often a wind instrument to accompany you, and the umbrella. And the next, and above him will be that plate with a special offering to the temple. And the next, and often at shrines, both Buddhist and Hindu, people, worshippers, will make a wish. That's a very important part of the whole ceremony of visiting temples. After you've made donations or before donations, you make a wish. The next. Now, the next deity that we'll approach has a very different trajectory. And she is much more, I won't say much more of a human, they're both humans, but this has a different flavor to it. And this is Patina, and she's strictly a Buddhist deity. Strictly. It's in the Buddhist canon. And she became a nun. And there were some 50 or 60 very important nuns who've left their writings and their poetry for us. And she's one of the most well-known. And the next, and her story starts, her plight begins, the next with her parents, like good parents, wanted her wed to the right man, and they were both wealthy families. They agreed on a marriage, but she didn't love him. So what does she do? She runs off with the servant, someone well beneath her caste and class. Her first big mistake. And so the obedience to parents is one of the key issues in the story of Patina. And so you see she runs off, and there's a big, I'm simplifying the story. I couldn't find a comic book fast enough on Amazon so I could show you this. So you see storms brewing, and her husband is going to build a little hut, goes chop some wood. A snake kills him. That's her first tragedy. And then she says with her 2 children, well, we're going to mom and dad's, even though they have had this bad history. We're going to mom and dad. So crossing the river, she can't carry 2 children at once, so she leaves her infant on the bank. And the infant on the bank, as she first crosses over, leaves the infant on the other side. But of course, what happens, we'll need the next slide to show this. a bird, a big hawk comes along, captures her infant, takes the child away, and then at that point the other child runs into the river and is blown away. So in one moment she's lost her husband and her 2 children through, in some ways, fault of her own. And then she says, oh, well, at least I can go home to mother and father. At least I'll have a roof over my head, even though her parents have rejected her earlier. And so she goes home, and the next, and then, well, I'll tell, I guess I don't have a slide to show, where she returns home. Her parents' house has collapsed in the same storm, and then she comes home to see the funeral pyre of her parents. So she's had these immense tragedies of losing everything. And so she goes, for lack of a better word, she goes crazy, as we all would go crazy if we had this kind of tragedy. And so she's running through the forest, and her clothes slip off, and she's completely naked, which in any society is odd and everything else, and people, she's gone crazy. And that's why, and we'll come to that in a minute, here in Burma, you can see the bird running off with the little child, and then her husband on the left, stricken by the snake, and the next. And this is the film that tells this, and I've got little clips of that film. The next. And this was harder to do because I was taking screenshots off YouTube for this one. But there she is. This is the Nepalese film. There she is by the bank with her child. And there are even clips of I couldn't get them fast enough, of the eagle, the bird coming in and trying to get the child. The next. And there they are. And the next. And the next. And the next. And there she is. A little bit dolled up, but she's really at that point where she has gone completely crazy, as one would expect. And so she comes the next, and there she is clothed, but she comes completely nude to the Buddhas and to the Buddhist. There's the pseudo-Buddha on the left and his group of monks, and a kind monk clothes her with this cloak. And the next. But it helps us to understand this human tragedy. It helps us to understand also Buddhism and how the Buddha incorporated, it sounds trite, but kindness and forgiveness. And the next, and there she is again, a Sri Lankan wall painting, and she's represented several times. This is not 3 or 4 women going crazy, but one, and then she moves closer to the Buddha. And you never see nudity like this, rarely, I should say, in Sri Lankan painting. And so people viewing this would know immediately, oh, that's Patina. And the next. And here on the right, you can see all of the incidents that I mentioned. The top right, the snake bite, the bird running off with the child drowning in the river. And then on the bottom, you see the house. That's not the house burning. It's a funeral pyre of her parents. And the next. And it's this, and this is a nun in modern Burma. And it's interesting to speculate. I mean, she's just an image to us, but one always wonders what was in her life before she became a nun. And the next. And one sees nuns throughout Burma. This is the morning alms gathering that we see, where lay people bestow usually food to the monks and to the nuns. The next. And this also touches, in many important respects, into the notions of impermanence. Impermanence, death is a classic example. Impermanence, and the notion that the universe is constantly changing, in flux. And the next. And for this, we'll see another famous Buddhist story known as Kisa Gotami, and who has a child, the next. And she's heard the Buddha's in town and can perform miracles. And she said, she comes to the Buddha with her child who's deathly ill, about to die, and said, can you perform a miracle and save my son? And the Buddha wisely said, well, if I'll do it, but you promise me you go to every house in town and knock on the door and ask, have you lost someone that you love? And of course the answer is yes, everybody's lost someone they love. And so she comes back to the Buddha, and the answer is obvious, that life is impermanent and life is all in flux. And so she now comes to realize in a deep existential way that this tragedy that's befallen her is part of life's impermanence and part of the universe's flux. And the next. And a measure of the importance of this, she's on a postage stamp, just as Patachara was on a postage stamp. This is from Sri Lanka. And it gives you, if you're not conversant with your Buddhist scripture and you're just received the letter from your friend, you can go to the text, Dhammapada, verse so-and-so, just to check up. Just as a refresher. You see on the bottom? That's like Genesis 5:3 or something. It's the quotation from the Buddhist canon. And the next. And with impermanence, we don't like to think about it, and this has nothing to do with the upcoming Halloween celebration, nothing to do with that. But and you see images like this throughout Southeast Asia, to reinforce the notion that, we're fine today, but tomorrow there's this inevitable cycle. And the next, very vividly, and the next. And so we come back to where we started. And I think you can see the next, that we all have ways of coping, of making sense of the senseless. And these two goddesses, it's not that they've made sense of it, but they've given us a window to how to make sense of it. And the next. And so Patachara, the nun, and Patini, God, the goddess. So it's these lessons that these two deities, these two female deities, offer us that I think it tells us far more about humanity than it does about Buddhism per se or Hinduism per se. And the next, finally, good evening. So thank you very much. Good.
Thank you.
Good.
We have a little bit of time for questions, if anybody
Or
has questions.
observations.
There's a microphone coming around, so if you just wait for it to show up.
7:30, 6:30.
At the very end, when our last heroine was surrounded by the monks,
Yeah.
had she sought repentance? Had she?
It wasn't. I think you heard the question. Heard the question. Did
You
she?
don't need it. You've
Yeah.
got that.
Did she seek repentance? It's not so much repentance for what she has nothing to. The only thing that she did that would be considered inappropriate would be the very bad thing of not listening to her mom and pop. She ran off. But it's and the people viewing this story, that's the repentance issue or the admission, oh, bad karma, good karma. That's not it. It's the Buddha's acceptance of her that is the key. That's how people see this, that the Buddha accepted this woman's tragedy and she became a nun. I'd recommend these stories to you. They're been translated into English. They're the nuns. You ask Mr. Amazon for these, and they're been translated. They're really good stories. And these women have all had tragedies. Their husbands left, or this or that, and that's why they became nuns. And often this is true today, too. I mean, not such flamboyant tragedies, but tragedies or personal things in one's life that have made them into the nuns. Well, I hope this talk made some sense. Yeah.
I wonder if you have any thoughts. I mean, I was so struck that you were able to illustrate your talk really well with contemporary images, right? Which shows how popular these stories are, and how these images disseminate all over the place, right?
Right.
And I would assume that probably this has been, since these are old stories, that this has been the case for a long time. So,
I know where your question is
Yeah.
coming from. And the simple answer is there are none. The question was, reading between the lines, why aren't you showing us beautiful old art? And I agree. I looked and looked.
But do you think that that's because
No.
they haven't survived, or
No.
because they weren't made?
I think that the reason they haven't survived, no, take it back. The reason these stories haven't been illustrated in pre-modern art is that commissioning them was not a tradition. Commissioning, and all those manuscripts you see in museums or in temples were commissioned for what? For good karma. And it was better karma to commission a proper text, a textual thing. The Jatakas, those previous birth stories, are in a little different category because those are so well known and they're part of a set. And so those are well illustrated. But apart from this 18th, 19th century wall painting from Sri Lanka, there are no cases in Sri Lanka or Burma where these deities in the pre-modern period have been depicted. But thinking about the Sri Lanka, well, if you had 18th century paintings, why not 14th century, 15th century? And it's entirely possible that the nuns for example, that people knew in manuscripts from centuries ago. It's entirely possible that there were, well, put it this way, there were certainly texts that talk about Patichara throughout the centuries, from the 4th century AD all the way up to today. There were texts, but I could not find any illustrations.
Also, I guess to go along with that, if there were not earlier illustrations, then I would assume that people wouldn't have actually been venerating those particular people,
right,
prior to
right,
more recent times.
No, there was veneration. Patini Devi. She was I'd have to research this one. There's a simple answer, but I don't know it. She must have been in Sri Lanka from a very early time. There are legends about a king coming into, but they've been discredited, these legends. The king bringing the anklet and bearing the anklet as a relic. But there are no illustrations pre-modern that I know of that I looked and looked, but not very hard. So if you find some, you let me know quickly. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So I'm curious, though, if there were no illustrations. What about the temples? Were there temples built to her way, way, way back?
Yes, I'd have to research that one, if there were specific Patini Devi temples. Certainly by the 18th, 17th century, there were Patini temples. And you could argue, if they had temples, then they had murals. And then, well, maybe the murals told the story. But not that I know of. I mean, in India, in Madras, there's plenty of art that has survived. But as far as I know, there are no early pre-modern images of Patini. But the story certainly survived. And the story, I think, has the stories in this Tamil text. It's a classic Tamil text, the anklet. And it was passed on through ballads, through poetry, through dramas, through Bharatanatyam, the dance. Probably. I'm just guessing. I'm not sure of that. So that there were many ways of passing on these stories. And look at the stories of saints that we have. And one of the things I didn't discuss about Patini, is a good example, is that she's this rage and this destruction, and this, in her case, not a horrible death. She just goes off into the wilderness. But the notion of violent deaths. And that's true. We find evidence. It's certainly true in Christianity, where so many saints came to violent ends, both men and women. Horrible deaths. And the question is, what about, why are people, deities, saints, these were real or semi-legendary, legendary people, why are these people who've suffered these violent deaths, why are they so potent for us? It's something about their rage and their deaths, especially their deaths, that make them not only martyrs, which was obvious, but what about a martyr should we worship? In some ways they failed. They failed to perform a miracle. And you've all read the stories of some saints who were torn apart by dogs and horrible things. And of course, in Christianity, the best example is the crucifixion. Christ in the crucifixion. And so he suffered a horrendous death. But there's something about that's not the suffering, I think, but there's the suffering, the unjustness of it all, that gives these personalities, for lack of a better word, gives these personalities the maybe it's the power, maybe that you're feeling when you see Christ or these saints, you're not only empathetic, obviously, but there may be something about their rage, the unjust nature of their deaths. And in Burma, the Nats perform that role, because these not pre-Buddhist, but these deities in Burma that are not Buddhist, many of them suffered these horrendous deaths, and they've become deified. And yes.
How many? I mean, are there many other women? I guess they're deities expressing other emotions, like this was despair and rage. So is there like a myriad of?
Oh,
other,
yeah.
So
Sure.
are we talking about hundreds? Or are we talking
Oh,
about?
well, the nuns themselves, these famous group of nuns, and that's part of the Pali Canon, goes back, oh my God, to centuries and 2,000 years old. And each of them will have different biographies, but many of them have been wronged, or many of them have had bad luck and suffered the consequences, but have found solace in following the Buddha. But Buddhism has so many positive and negative women. You can't count them all.
So they exemplify different things.
Oh,
might be
yeah.
one on
And generally,
forgiveness, or one on.
Well, I'd have to, but they're not known for that.
Okay.
They're not known for a specific thing.
The way these two
But
are known.
Jatakas are known for those birth stories. This is one for self-sacrifice. This is one for patience. This is one for being good sons and daughters. That's true for Jatakas. But the women in Buddhism, like our earth deity, or the Buddha's mother, but in general, women are, in general, temptresses to take men's minds off. And that's very clear. Or even somebody like Emperor Ashoka. He had a good wife, and he had a bad one. And they're both, Buddhism loves to contrast the good wife, the bad wife, the good husband, the bad husband. And they are, the stories are just really, really nice. But